Good morning. Once again, good to see everybody here. Hope you all are having a great Sunday morning. Today we're going to be picking up in our study in the book of Romans, and we find ourselves in Romans chapter 11. So we're going to be starting in verse 1 there in Romans chapter 11. And of course we're dealing with this very deep theological section of the book of Romans in which the Apostle Paul begins to reflect on his fellow countrymen. And he had mentioned in chapter 8 this persecution that was going on, and that even though they might be persecuted, still nothing could separate them from the love of God. And then he goes on to talk about his Jewish brethren and things, and how he really wished that they would come to salvation, that he would be willing to be separated himself from Christ in order for them to be saved. And he reiterates that in chapter 10 as well at the beginning. And so he's kind of dealing with, what's going on with the Jews here in the first century. And maybe even larger than that, what's going on with God? Is there any unrighteousness with God? He said in chapter 9. And what is God doing with the Jews? Has God brought the Jews along, given them all these promises, the covenants, the law, the sacrificial service, all these things only to pull the rug out from under them and to totally forsake them? This is what he's dealing with. And we continue that thought here in chapter 11. Matter of fact, in verse 1, he says, I say then, has God rejected his people? And that's a very important statement. Now, one of the things about chapters 9 through 11 in the book of Romans is that oftentimes we perhaps are going through the book of Romans, maybe you're listening to Romans on audio, or you're reading through it, and it's like you get, chapter 6, yes, my old self was crucified with Christ, I've died to sin. Chapter 7, there's this wrestling between the flesh and the law, and then you get into chapter 8, and it talks about the law of the Spirit of life, and it's very vibrant and very interactive and very applicable. And then we get to chapter 9 through 11, we're like, now he's talking about the Jews, so okay, I'll check out for a little bit, and then get back into it in chapter 12 with the transformation of my mind. We might think, chapters 9 through 11 doesn't really apply to us because it's primarily speaking about God's dealing with the Jews. But in this one statement, there's a lot for us, at least two things, and we could probably pick out more than that, at least two reasons why this statement's important to us. For one, if it is true that God has rejected his people, what does that mean for us? If God can make promises, and if God can make covenants, and if God can work with people, and then all of a sudden just kind of turn his back to them and reject them altogether, what does that mean for us? Because we too are covenantal people. We people in covenant with God. We too have promises, even promises that far surpass those that they had in the old law. We have great and precious promises. If God did it to them, he could do it to us as well. So has God rejected his people? So that could be what he's referring to, looking back at what he's talked about in chapters 9 and 10. Or looking ahead, he might be making the statement to say, has God rejected his people? Okay, now Gentiles, you have a right to boast over them. Well, you Jews, God's rejected you, so you guys aren't important anymore. Therefore, now we're taking the helm, and we're the ones that are important. Has God rejected his people? And he's going to deal with that, having a humble spirit as a Gentile in connection to viewing what's going on with the Jews. So it could be looking forward, don't be boastful. It could be looking backwards, saying, no, God hasn't rejected his people. He is faithful. He is true. Either way you go, it's a very important point for even us as Gentiles who feel like perhaps this whole context doesn't really apply to us. It has tremendous impact for us because it falls back on the very character of God. And that's always applicable to everyone who has a relationship with him. So he says, I say then, has God rejected his people? And Paul's very firm. He says, may it never be. Of course, God hasn't rejected his people. That's not how God works. He says, for I too am an Israelite, a seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So he says, if God's rejected his people completely, then what about me? I'm a Jew. And he's presenting himself as the great example, as a prime example for this. One, because it's him. He's speaking out of his own personal experience, but also because the Apostle Paul, as we mentioned before, I think it was when we were in chapter 10, 2 weeks ago, the Apostle Paul fell into that mold. Like what the Jews were experiencing in the first century is exactly what he had experienced. persecuting, not only not believing in Jesus, but giving approval of those who were persecuting those who believed in Jesus, actively persecuting the church, trying to squash this blasphemous cult that he thought it was. He was a violent a violent aggressor. He tells Timothy in 1 Timothy, like he was the Jew that is being under discussion here. But he said, but I found mercy. God came to me and touched my life. I've turned around now, and I have received, even though I was that before, I did fit into that mold. Now I've received mercy. And so there is still hope for the Jewish people. If I can receive mercy, if Paul was making commentary on this, he would probably say, if I can find mercy, that means all the Jews can find mercy as well. Even if they've been persecuting, even if they have been very belligerent and hard-hearted, there's still hope for them. So God hasn't completely rejected them. There's still mercy that can be extended to them. And God would be faithful in extending his mercy to them as Jews. So no, he hasn't rejected them. There's still hope for them, he would say. And that kind of follows through the whole chapter. There's still hope for the Jews. He says, and then he talks about this remnant. He says, or in the middle of verse 2, he says, or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have left for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In this way, then, at the present time, a remnant, according to God's gracious choice, has also come to be. So the Apostle Paul says, not only am I saved as a Jew, and therefore God hasn't totally rejected his people, there's also a remnant of people. There's actually other Jews that have accepted the gospel. We could look back in the book of Acts, the 3,000 that came to the Lord there in Acts chapter 2, and increases to 5,000. And in Jerusalem, it got so big that you couldn't even count them all. There was a remnant. Percentage-wise, it wasn't a great percentage, but still, there was that remnant of people who accepted the Messiah that was sent to them, who placed their faith in what God had done through the Messiah, and had turned their lives over to God and received freely the grace that God had extended to them. And so that also proves, of course, that God hasn't rejected his people, that there is still room for forgiveness. And God always has a remnant, doesn't he? You could go back to Noah. Noah was a remnant of the whole world. He was really the only one living a righteous life before God. We could think about also Abraham, who was called out in the time of a little bit after the Tower of Babel. We could also think about Lot, with Sodom and Gomorrah. There's just a little handful of people left, but he saved them. God always has a remnant. And that went all the way through, even when Israel was unfaithful with the idol worship. There were still people, faithful Jews, who were listening to God and were sensitive to what he was telling them. And we could say even throughout church history, there's always been those faithful few that stay connected to God, plugged into what he wants for them. God always has a remnant, and that was true in the time of Paul. A remnant was still there. And this can be an encouragement for us, because now making a little bit broader application, aren't there sometimes times when we feel alone in our faith? Maybe we feel like Elijah, like at the workplace, I'm the only one who's trying to serve the Lord. There's people who might pay lip service, but they're not really trying to serve the Lord. They don't have a passion for the Lord like I do, and I feel alone in my zest and my zeal for the Lord. Or maybe in our family, on the holidays, we go visit family. We're the only ones that are Christians, and we're maybe around other people who don't share the same faith as us, and we feel alone and we feel lonely in that situation. We need to remember God's remnant in those situations. You're not alone. You might be alone in that particular context, yes, but you're not alone ultimately. In 1 Peter chapter 5, when Peter warns against or tells us to be looking out for the devil, he says in verse 9, but resist him firm in the faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished among your brethren who are in the world. Remember that there's other people out there with the same struggles, the same hardships, the same temptations, the same trials. You're not alone. Just because you can't visibly see them, Elijah couldn't visibly see the 7,000 that God had reserved. They were still there, and they were still remaining faithful to Yahweh. And we too have to remember that. And that's what's so wonderful about the church. When we're out in the world, we do oftentimes feel lonely. We feel like we're the only ones that have this particular worldview in our context, whatever that context may be. And when we come together with the remnant, when we come together with those who have placed their faith in Jesus Christ, those who are walking faithfully before him, that's an encouragement. It's like Elijah walking into the cave with the 7,000, being able to look around and say, you know what, I'm not alone. Look at all these people that are also serving the Lord. That's how the church can serve. When we come through the doors on Sunday morning, we get encouragement knowing that there's other people who are trying to serve the Lord, who's trying to remain faithful to him, and that's a great encouragement. When we are the Lone Ranger out there, spiritually speaking, and we don't go to church, and we don't ever fellowship with other believers, and we never have contact with people with like-minded faith, yeah, you're going to feel very alone. And that's the importance, again, of plugging into a community of believers and being encouraged in that way. But the Apostle Paul is saying this to say that, yes, on the surface, it looks like the Jews have been rejected by God. You look around, every synagogue he would go to, he was pushed out of town or even chased into the next town. On the surface, it looked very bleak and very dismal. It looked like the Jews were just completely rejecting it. God must have rejected them because they're not receiving the message. But Paul said, throughout all of that, what it looks like on the surface, underneath it all, I'm coming into contact with people continuously who are turning to the Lord. And Apostle Paul might have particular Jews in his mind, Aquila and Priscilla and others in his mind, that he says, yeah, I know some people personally who have come to the Lord. God has not rejected his people. There is a remnant of Jews, even today, he would say, who are remaining faithful to the Lord, who has accepted the gracious gift of God through Jesus Christ. But he says in verse 6, but if it is by grace, it is no longer of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. In other words, the remnant is not, when he talks about the remnant, he's not talking about the few Jews who are actually getting the law right, who actually are getting all the sacrifices correct, who are following the law of Moses to a T, and that's the remnant. No, he's saying the remnant are those who are receiving the free gift of God through Jesus Christ, who's accepting the gospel. That's the remnant. Those are the ones who are being accepted by God, not rejected by God, because they believe in what God has promised and what God is doing in their present day. In verse 7, he says, what then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But the chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Who are the chosen? The chosen are those who believe. God had already predestined or preordained that those who had faith in his son, those are the ones that he would choose to be his people. Not the ones who tried to make it through the works of the law, not those who tried to work their way to heaven or build a tower to heaven like the Tower of Babel or anything like that, but those who would freely receive the gift offered to them through Jesus Christ, who would accept by faith what God had given them. Those are the chosen ones. And there's chosen ones among the Gentiles, there's chosen ones among the Jews, but he said the rest were hardened. And that's what he goes on to describe here as he quotes from Deuteronomy 29 and from the Psalms. He says, just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs forever. Here what's being described is the discipline of God towards those who didn't believe. Time and time again throughout the scriptures, you see this as a means by which God disciplines his people. Okay, you don't want to accept what I'm offering you, or you don't believe me in this. In return, I'm going to give you a hard heart. I'm going to give you eyes that cannot see, ears that cannot hear. I'm going to cause you to stumble because you've rejected the very one that could bring about salvation, or you reject those who are giving you the word that I am speaking to you. And so he said, you know what, I'll just harden their hearts. And they will stumble over that. David says, let their table become a snare and a trap. In other words, all the blessings that God had given them, and God had immensely blessed Israel. You could think about physically, they've been placed in the perfect spot, geographically, where there's plenty of water, plenty of vegetation. I mean, just a land flowing with milk and honey, to put it in biblical terms. Put them in a beautiful, sweet spot on the earth. But he also blessed them spiritually with the covenants, with the law. all this was on their table. They had a table spread out before them of blessing, but all those blessings became a trap. Those blessings caused them to become puffed up, caused them to think that they could approach God through their own works, and caused them to stumble into disobedience and disbelief and unbelief. And so, because of that, they were having a hard time accepting what God had done for them through Jesus. In verse 11, he says, I say then, did they stumble so as to fall? Okay, so God did discipline them. He hardened their hearts. And we'll see in a minute that was also to fulfill another purpose, but it was a discipline that God had placed on them. But it wasn't a permanent situation. It's not like God hardened their hearts and they can never receive the gospel again. The Apostle Paul had his heart hardened, but it was softened on that road to Damascus as God touched his life. It's not a permanent situation. It's not like God hardened their hearts and now the Jews can never come to salvation. They did not stumble so as to fall. It says, may it never be. But by their transgression, salvation have come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. All right, so now he's kind of getting into what he's going to be talking about further. It's like, okay, you didn't believe in me. Now I'm going to discipline you by giving you a hard heart, eyes that cannot see, ears that cannot hear, a spirit of stupor. I'm going to put that on you. And in doing that, then, I'm going to use that to bless the rest of the world. And you could trace that back to Jesus' death on the cross. It was the Jews that didn't believe in Jesus, even though he performed miracles, even though he spoke the words of God. They rejected him. They had a hard heart. Ears. Jesus himself talks about how they had ears that couldn't hear, eyes that couldn't see. They were hardened to bring about the crucifixion of Christ. But it was through that hardness and that transgression that the crucifixion came and then salvation came. So through transgression, God used that for good. But you could also go further than that and just look at what's going on in the first century where the Jews are hardened. They are very much persecuting those who are coming to faith. And what's happening in Paul's day? The gospel is just spreading. Remember when Stephen was stoned and the persecution that came after that? What happened? The church spread and they went everywhere proclaiming the gospel. And through the hard heart of the Jews, through the stoning of Stephen, it went into Samaria, it went up into Antioch, and from Antioch it spread west to Asia and different places. All that was because of the hardness of the Jews' heart. And so God is utilizing their unbelief, but using it in a way that would bring benefit. So God is able to cause all things to work for good for those who are called according to his purpose, chapter 8 talks about. And we see this all through scriptures. Time and time again, God uses people's sin, their rebellion, their transgressions to bring about his purpose. In other words, there's nothing that man can do to thwart God's plan. As a matter of fact, God can even utilize that to bring forth his plan all the more. That's how wise he is. That's how powerful he is. That's how strong he is. He's able to do that. Thinking about that in personal terms, we need to remember too, maybe we think our transgressions are too bad, that God can't use us anymore because maybe I did something that brought shame to myself or shame to my family, or I've just stumbled too much, I've wandered away too far, God can't use me anymore. I'm pretty much a lost cause now. You might as well just crumble me up and throw me in the trash can because I've sinned too much. God can never use my life because I've sinned so much. Don't be so quick to say that. He can even use your sin to bring about good. It might very well be that because you rebelled so much and you had this long history of rebelling, that now you can use that when you're sharing people with the grace that you've experienced through Jesus Christ. You can show them, look, this is where I was. And look at the grace that was extended to me. If God can heal me, if God can forgive me, he can do that for anyone. Paul uses that time and time again in his writings. But God can use even our rebellion to his purpose. Now, that's not to say, well, let's go sin so that good can come out of it. Paul talks about that previous in Romans, that now we don't do good so that we don't do evil so that good may come. That's not right at all. It's more smoother if we align our lives with God and walk the path of righteousness before him. But the idea is that if we get off the track, God can still utilize those things for his purpose and his plan. God worked through David and Bathsheba. He worked through all these evil kings, but eventually it brought about the Messiah. In other words, God's never wringing his hands saying, oh, they messed up now, I don't know what I'm going to do. God can still utilize those things for his purpose and his plan. So he says, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. We'll talk about that more in a moment. I'll hold off because he's going to dive into that more in a minute. In verse 12, now if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fullness be? They've rejected, if God was able to utilize their disbelief, and because they disbelieved, they did not believe in the Messiah, he hardened their hearts and utilized that hardness to then spread the gospel more. If God could utilize that, how much better would it be if they would just accept the gospel? Think about if the Jews, just speaking in our day and age, let's just imagine the Jews were to accept the gospel today. Just all of them would accept it, maybe not every single Jew, but just generally you would see Jews flooding into the church. Think about the richness that would come out of that. Think about what they could bring to the church. They're the ones who spent their whole lives trying to observe the law. They're in that mind frame of the law and keeping the traditions and all of those things. They could bring that knowledge into the church. Not that we would follow the law, but just so that they could come from that standpoint of, hey, yeah, I've observed the Passover, and this is what I experienced while I was observing the Passover. But wow, now that I see Christ, I really see how the Passover fulfilled. I mean, they could really bring in a lot of experience and knowledge to that. We could think of people who were Jews that were converted to Christianity. I have one particular guy in mind. His name is escaping me. I think it's Edersheim. I think is his name. He's a guy who in the early 19th or 20th century was a Jew converted, and he brought in a lot of Jewish understanding to like the New Testament text, like cultural things, historical things that brought a lot of richness to many people's study. The Jews can bring a lot of that with them. How wonderful it would be if the Jews did accept the gospel. They'd have a lot to offer to the church if they were to do that. And the Apostle Paul sees that. He says, how wonderful it would be. If their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more would their fullness be? In verse 13, but I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles. Okay, so he said, even though I'm talking about the Jews, I want the Jews to be converted, and I'm focused on the Jews. I'm speaking to you Gentiles. The church at Rome was primarily Gentile, but he's turning his attention to them to say, inasmuch as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So he says, in the back of my mind, yes, I want the Gentiles to be saved. He's genuine. I don't think it would fit Paul's character to say that he was just preaching to the Gentiles, but he was only doing it to get to the Jews and that he didn't really care about the Gentiles. I don't think that's what he's describing here. What he's saying is, yes, I'm concerned about the Gentiles. I'm preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. He was given a specific calling to go to the Gentiles. But all in the back of his mind, he's saying, maybe if I convert a lot of Gentiles, my Jewish brethren will see that. They'll see the joy, the peace, the salvation that they receive and be provoked to jealousy and want to receive that as well. So the Apostle Paul, all the while he's preaching to the Gentiles, hasn't forgotten about his brothers and sisters or his fellow countrymen. No, God hasn't rejected his people. Paul even still has hope for his people that they'll be provoked to jealousy and return. I guess if you're thinking about it like children, you could think about, well, for one, say you have a child, the only child that's in the home. The only child, and this happens a lot. You have the first child, and everything's about that child, right? The parents pour everything into that child. The child has, all the toys. The child has, all the night songs. They have everything. Like the parents are focused on that one child. But then the parents have a second child, and that child's like, wait, what's going on? Now mom and dad are going to have a second child? Does that mean that they're going to reject me now? Does that mean that now I'm no longer going to be important to them? They're not going to love me now that they love this baby child? That's kind of seems to be maybe what the Jews are thinking. They're like, we were God's people. We were the ones that had all the attention, but now God's turning his attention to the Gentiles. Does that mean then that we're not God's children, that God doesn't love us? And Paul's saying no. But also embedded in this, if you're sticking with that analogy, is the idea that he's blessing to the Gentiles. He's blessing the Gentiles, yes, so that the Jews will turn and see that in turn as well. It's kind of like if a child was being rebellious, they weren't listening to their parents, and the parent says, okay, you're not listening, you're not getting dessert tonight. Well, there would be two things that are going on. One, the child would be sad because they're not getting dessert. But then they would look over and they'd see their brothers and sisters eating that ice cream or that pecan pie or whatever, and they'd be looking and be like, ah. And the next day they'd be like, well, I want some of that. So they begin to obey. Like, one, they're being disciplined, yes, by being restrained from that, but at the same time, they're being provoked to jealousy in that they want what they have, and that's prompting them to then want to do it. It's kind of, it might be a bad analogy, but it kind of falls in with what Paul's talking about here, that the Jews didn't believe in God. They rejected the Messiah that was sent to them. God gave them a hard heart, kept them distant from the blessings for a time, so that when they did see the Gentiles eating the dessert, for lack of a better term or metaphor, they would be provoked to want to do that as well. Wow, look at all the peace, the joy, the life that they have, the love that they're sharing between one another. We want to be a part of that. We want to be connected to that. So, on the one hand, they're receiving discipline, but on the other hand, they're also given adequate promptings to want to join in with what the Gentiles are receiving. He says, verse 15, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So if they're rejecting, and he's not conceding saying, yes, God did reject them, but he's just saying in this experience that they're having where they feel rejected and they have separated themselves from the blessings of God through disbelief, that's led to the reconciliation of the world, the gospel being spread to all different nations and tribes and tongues. What will their acceptance be but life from the dead? It would be kind of like the Ezekiel vision of the valley of dry bones. Like, right now, they're dry bones out in the field. But if they would but accept the gospel, the sinews, the flesh would be back on them, and then the breath of God would come upon them and bring them back to life again. Definitely, if in that Ezekiel vision you look at the bones and say, God's not done with the bones, you could look at the Jewish people in the first century and say, God's not done with the Jewish people in the first century. They may look like dry bones, but God can still bring them back to life if they would but accept the Messiah. And he'll talk about that more in a moment. And then verse 16, this is another word for the Gentiles. Remember now, Paul has already kind of turned his attention to the Gentiles, and he's focusing on them. And it's important to remember that as you get into verse 16, otherwise it's a little difficult to interpret. But he says, and if the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. What does he mean by that? Well, based on the context, I believe the best way to interpret that is to say to the Gentiles, look, don't say the Jews are unholy. Don't say the Jews are no good, that God's rejected them, and, well, they can be thrown away with the trash now that we have the gospel. Don't say that they're bad. Matter of fact, if you say or though they had the first fruits of the covenants, the promises, the blessings of God, to say that they're holy, you're connected to them and that you've been grafted in to what they have. So you want to say that they're holy because you're connected to them. So if the first dough is holy, the lump is also. And then if the root is holy, the root of the covenants, the blessings of the patriarchs and things like that, if you look at those as holy, you'll say, well, as a branch connected to that, that means that I'm holy too. So in other words, by calling them holy and not rejecting them or looking down your nose on them, remember that you're connected to the blessings that they had. So don't look down on them with contempt. If they're holy, then when you say that they are holy, God's chosen people, you're in a sense saying that you yourself are connected to that and that you're holy as well. He'll go on to say in verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, And you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree. Do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast against them, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So that kind of falls in line with what he said in verse 16. He says, some of the branches were broken off. There were some Jews that didn't believe. There were some Jews that, they did not accept the Messiah. They're broken off. As Jesus says in John chapter 15, those who don't bear fruit, the branches that don't bear fruit connected to the vine are cut off and cast into the fire. They were broken off, and you were grafted in. You were a wild olive tree, but you were grafted into that rich root of the olive tree. I don't think it's any accident they used in the olive tree. The olive tree back in ancient times was seen as a tree of blessing. It's been a while since I've researched this, but if I'm correct, cities would oftentimes plant olive trees outside the perimeter of their wall to show how abundant they were. They showed how good they were. If Gethsemane literally means the oil press, and there were olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane. Maybe there's something with that as well, but usually it was connected to affluence, wealth, blessing. The olive tree was seen as that. And I believe that the Apostle Paul is specifically mentioning an olive tree because of that. He's talking about the tree of blessing. The root of it was the covenants that God had made with the patriarchs, and outflowing from that root was the blessings that God had brought forth because of those covenants and those promises. And those who remained in faith were connected to those blessings. They were connected to the olive tree, receiving life and blessing from the tree. But those who did not believe were cut off from the blessings of God. They were no longer God's covenantal people because they no longer stayed connected through faith. But the Apostle Paul is saying, but don't boast about that. Don't say, well, the Jews rejected it, now I'm in there, I'm connected to it. Remember where the root comes from. The root comes from the Jewish people. The root comes from Abraham. It comes from Jacob and all of those. Don't get boastful. Don't get arrogant about it. Remember where you come from. You're connected to what they were blessed with, not the other way around. In verse 19, you will say then, branches were broken off so that I may be grafted in. You can just sense the air of arrogance in that statement. He says, quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief. For their unbelief. But you stand by your faith. Don't be haughty, but fear. Exactly. So don't be prideful because they were broken off. And this is applicable where you're talking about Jews or you're just talking about unbelievers in our lives. We might look at other people who are not connected to the blessings. They don't have the blessings that we have. Maybe we see people fall into sin, all the consequences of sin. We see what a mess they make of their lives. We shouldn't look at that and say, I'm glad I didn't fall into that. Or I'm glad I have all the blessings of God and not them. Remember, you are who you are because of faith, not because of anything that you are. That very well could be you. We should not be haughty against those who are perhaps having to deal with the bad consequences of their actions, but be warned by that. Be warned by that. It's kind of like the child who's eating the pudding or the ice cream. They're eating the dessert, looking at the other child, I got ice cream. You better be... Instead of looking at that child with contempt, you ought to be saying, oh, that could happen to me. If I don't obey, I'll be the one sitting in the chair watching everyone else eat cobbler or whatever it is. Just, instead of being haughty, fear. Look at that as a warning to yourself to hold on to your faith. Don't separate yourself from God through disbelief. In verse 21, he says, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Verse 22, behold then the kindness and severity of God to those who fell, and were those who have stumbled and fell, he's brought forth severity, hardened their hearts, that sort of thing. But to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. So this is a little bit getting into some theological waters here, but Apostle Paul says it is possible to be broken off if you get into a state of disbelief. Just because you're connected now doesn't mean you're never, it's impossible for you to ever be cut off. You're there because of faith, and you remain there because of faith, and you got to hold on to that faith. But I like this what Paul says. He says, behold the kindness and severity of God. God has allowed the tares to grow up with the wheat. In other words, as we talked about before, I can't remember if it was chapter 9. I think it was chapter 9. When we were in chapter 9. God didn't just say, well, the Jews didn't believe, wipe them all out and be done with it. He's let them kind of go along with the believers as well. And in doing so, he's demonstrating two things at the same time, all the time. To the Gentiles or anyone who receives the gospel, Jews and Gentiles, he's constantly reminding us of his love. For God so loved his world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish. And God has lavished his love through Jesus Christ. Christ died for us, and he gave himself up for us. And the love and the kindness of God is always being demonstrated. Every time someone comes and receives the gospel and receives the mercy of God, that's being demonstrated. But at the same time, alongside that, you might be looking at that on the right hand, then you turn to your left hand, and you see the severity of God. People who have rejected the Messiah, people who have a rough go at it because they haven't connected themselves to the blessings of God through faith. That's going on continuously so that both things can be demonstrated, God's kindness and also his severity. And as a child, going back to the child analogy, I guess because I have a lot of children, all my analogies are about children, but going back to the children analogy, that's perfect parenting. Connect and correct. If you're missing either one of those, you're off balance. There's some parents that all they are is kind. Like, the child can never do anything wrong. If something's wrong, it must be me. And it's just constantly just kindness, lavishing things over the children. I want to make them happy, so I just give them a whole bunch of stuff. And it's all about kindness. But there's really no firmness. There's no discipline. There's no correction. And so the child becomes spoiled and rebellious. But then you have other parents who have no kindness. They're like always severe. The kid can't ever do anything right. If I'm telling you anything, it's just telling you what you did wrong. The child then becomes rebellious because they become discouraged and angry and hostile and all that stuff. You got to have a balance. Severity and kindness. Show the kid that you love them. Show them compassion when it's appropriate. Love them, lavish your love on them, but at the same time, let them know that there are boundaries that you cannot cross and hold them to that. God does that perfect. As a parent, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge to know, when am I being too kind? When am I being too severe? It's always swaying back and forth. God has it both. But both of those things lead people to obedience. I obey my parents because I know they love me, because they've done so many good things for me. They provide for me, they care for me, they take me on trips and all these different things. I want to obey them because I love them. I also want to obey them because I don't want to cross them. I don't want mom and daddy to know that I've done bad things or to see me do bad things, and so I'm going to obey. So both of those things lead us in the direction of obedience. And the obedience that the Jews needed was to believe in the Messiah. What may we do that we would do the works of God? Believe in the one that he sent, John chapter 6 says. But then he goes on in verse 23. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. So again, this hardness is not God hardening their hearts so they can't ever believe. It was a temporary thing that he did to discipline them, but also to bring about his purpose, to extend the gospel to the Gentiles and then turning backwards to provoke them to jealousy so that they would believe. The ultimate goal of God was reconciliation of the Jews to himself, not just hardening their hearts and then casting them away. If they'll believe, they'll be grafted in, just as I was, the Apostle Paul could say. For God is able to graft them in again. Paul was grafted in, they can be grafted in. In verse 24, but if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So it'd just be very natural for them to be grafted in, because that's what the tree was for. And all those covenants, the blessings, the sacrifices, were all pointing to Christ. So if they accept Christ, they're connecting back to everything that streamed to Christ previous to that. Gentiles, we're in a wild olive tree. Like, we're out there, whatever, we're kind of trying to get our own blessings, trying to get, just trying to run the course of this world and trying to do things according to our own promptings and desires. That was a wild olive tree, but we're grafted into this cultivated olive tree, one produced by God himself, cared for by God, who tended to it personally. that's a great blessing. But the idea here is that it would be even more natural for the Jews to be grafted in than even you Gentiles. So don't be prideful. Don't think that you're better than them because you've been grafted in. We're running out of time. I wanted to finish chapter 11, but we're about to get upon a very deep subject, and all Israel being saved. What does that mean? Tune in next time for I'll tell you all about it. No. Even in that, we're going to, getting into it, but we're going to look at it from the context of Jesus. Don't read too much into that. Don't take too much away from that. Keep in the context. Again, Paul is just trying to keep us from being prideful, that there is a future, that we shouldn't be prideful against the Jews. God is still working among the Jews, and they have access to salvation. The same thing he's been saying, but anyways, I'm trailing off. That there ends our lesson this morning. I do appreciate your kind attention. I know this is very theologically rich, deep, dense things that we're trudging through. And I do appreciate that y'all are paying attention and following along. We're going to see this is all going to lead to worship. Theology should always lead to worship. Theology is just not there so that we can be smarter or to have some leg up on someone else. It should lead us to worship. For from him, through him, and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So let's always keep that in mind. But thank you for your kind attention. If you're here this morning and you've been thinking about all these things and you realize that, yes, my brother, my sister, my coworker, you're thinking maybe of someone that you say, wow, they have so much life. They have so much peace. They have so much joy in their lives. And I realize that they have a hope, and even though they go through hard times, they seem to encounter those with faith and stuff, and I've been inspired by looking at the blessings that they have, and I want a part of that. I want to be a part of that and receive the same thing. Maybe you've been provoked to jealousy, not in a bad sense, but in the sense that you want the blessings of God in your life as you've seen other people be blessed by God. Come to him. Remember the kindness of God, but also remember the severity of God. If you reject him, he's very compassionate and merciful for a time, but eventually he does have to bring judgment. He has to back up his law through his just nature. Don't wait too long. Come to him while you can, while his arms are extended, while his kindness is offered to you. Please come to him today. Receive salvation, receive eternal life, be baptized into Christ, and be clothed with Christ for eternal blessings that are connected to Christ. Do that today. Don't put it off. Come forward as we stand and sing the song that Dylan has prepared.